In this section, we're going to put some of what we have learned into practice. We'll create a tool for playing around with CSS's perspective properties. I've provided the starter files for this project in the resource section of this lecture. Download the zip file, unpack it on your system, and point your editor to the project. Pause the video if you need to. If you open the HTML file, you'll be greeted with this page. On the left, we have input fields for changing various properties of the box on the right. There's also this fun animation playing in the background. We'll change the perspective and rotation CSS properties of the box. The goal is to apply the changes in real time. We should be able to see the box move whenever we move the sliders. At the moment, nothing happens if we move the sliders. Let's view the files in the editor. We'll start with the index.html file. At the top of the file, we're loading in a CSS file called main.css. If we look inside the main.css file, we'll find some basic styles. The styles I've provided are not specific to Vue. We won't need to worry about them impacting our application. Let's go back to the index file. In the body tags, we'll find a div tag with the app class. This element is where we'll be mounting the instance. It'll house the application we're about to build. Inside the container, we'll find pairs of labels and inputs. There are a total of 4 pairs. Each input will change a CSS property of the box. The CSS properties we'll be changing require numeric values. We're using the range input type to restrict the values the user can input. This type will create a slider for us. We're limiting the range because the CSS properties we'll use have limits. Above the input, there's a label that contains the value from the slider. Neither the label nor input is connected with the box. We'll need to add some expressions and directives. We'll get to that in a moment. Below the inputs are 2 buttons. One button is for resetting the box. We'll allow the user to reset the box in case they need to. The other button will copy the properties to achieve this effect to the user's clipboard. We'll be using event listeners and methods to handle this scenario. If we scroll down further, we'll find a div tag with a class called box. We'll be updating this element with the data from the instance. We'll need to bind the style attribute to accomplish this. Below this, we have an element called CSS Doodle. This element will create the background effect we saw on the page. We aren't going to cover how CSS Doodle works. I've added it in to add a cool effect. It's not going to affect how we write the Vue application. At the very bottom of the file, there are 3 scripts that are being loaded. The 2 scripts are CSS Doodle and Vue. The third is the app.js file. Let's open this file next. This file will be empty. We'll be creating the application from scratch. Before we tackle this together, I recommend trying this on your own. It's an excellent opportunity to try testing your knowledge. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. If you were able to get the app working, congrats. If not, that's fine as well. We'll work on it together. I want to mention if you came up with a different solution than what I'm about to show you, that's fine. As long as you're using Vue to get the tool working, you can consider the project completed. Let's work on it together. The first thing we'll do is create a Vue instance. We need to tell Vue what element in the document it will mount itself to. Inside the app.js file, we'll call the vue.createApp function. We'll pass in an empty configuration object. We'll add some properties after mounting the application. After calling this function, we'll chain the mount method. The mount method requires we pass in a selector for the element we want to mount the application to. We'll pass in #app. Next, we'll create the data properties for the box. We'll create the following properties. Perspective 100. Rotate X 0. Rotate Y 0. Rotate Z 0. The 4 properties we created will contain the value for each input. The values we've assigned to each property is the default value assigned by the browser. The properties are ready. We can begin to tie them to their respective label and input. Back in the document file, we'll start from the top and work our way down. The first field is for the perspective of the box. We'll add the vModel directive to the input field. Its expression will be the perspective property. Above the input, there's a label that contains the current value of the input. We'll want to make it dynamic. We'll replace the number with an expression. The expression will be the perspective property. The process is the same for the next field. The field below is for the rotation of the box on the x-axis. We'll add the vModel directive to the input element. The expression will be the rotate x property. We'll update the label to output the rotate x property. We're going to replace the number in the label. We'll do the same for the next input, which is for the rotation of the box on the y-axis. The input will be bound to the rotate y property with the vModel directive. We'll replace the number with the rotate y property in the label. Lastly, we have an input for the rotation of the box on the z-axis. We'll bind the input to the rotate z property with the vModel directive. The label will output the value of the rotate z property. We're finished with controlling the inputs with Vue. Let's refresh the page in the browser to check if it works. We're able to drag the slider back and forth. We can tell the properties are bound to the input because the labels above the input get updated. We're finished with the first step. The next step is to bind the properties to the box. After we're finished binding the properties to the box, we'll reset the properties when the Reset button is clicked. Let's go back to the editor. In the document, we're going to bind the Style attribute. I'm going to use the shorthand version of binding the attribute. It's a colon followed by the name of the attribute we want to bind. We're going to bind the property to a computed property called box. We have the option of adding the properties in the expression. However, we're going to be changing 4 properties of the box element. It's going to clutter the template. It would be better to outsource the object into a computed property where we can better read the code. Let's switch over to the app file. We'll add a property to the configuration object called computed. This property will be an object where we can define computed properties. We're going to define a computed property called box. Inside this function, we must return a value. We're going to return an object. The object returned by this function will be bound to the element's style properties. Vue will take care of converting this object into a compatible attribute value for the element. We're going to set the transform property to a string template. The transform property allows us to rotate, skew, and translate an element's coordinates. We can use it to apply the 4 properties we have in the data object. We're going to set the property to the following value: perspective this.perspective px. We're using the perspective function to shift the distance of the element between the user and the z-plane. It can make an element appear closer or farther than it is. Next, we'll add the rotate x function. Its value will be the this.rotatex property with the degrees unit measurement. We must use the degrees unit if we want to rotate an element. This unit of measurement goes for the other rotate functions too. Up next, we'll add the rotate y function with the rotate y property. Lastly, we'll add the rotate z function with the rotate z property. We're finished with binding the properties to the box. We'll test our code in a moment. First, I want to work on resetting the properties if the Reset button is clicked. In the configuration object, we'll add another property called methods. We'll define a method we can call when the user clicks on the button. The name of the method will be reset. Inside this function, we're going to reset the perspective, rotate X, rotate Y, and rotate Z properties to their original values in the data object. Let's update our template to use this function. Back in the document, search for the button in the template. It's located below the input fields. We'll add an event listener with the @ character. This character is the same as typing the v-on directive. It's a shorthand method of listening for an event. We'll listen for the click event with the prevent modifier. The prevent modifier will prevent the browser's default behavior when a button is clicked. It's always good practice to prevent the default behavior in case the browser does anything weird. We're finished with the app. The last thing we need to do is test the application in the browser. As I make changes to the input fields, the box on the right changes in real time. I can use any combination of values. The box will be able to handle it with ease. If I don't like what I have, I can click on the reset button to go back. Perfect. The last thing we'll work on is the button for copying the properties to the user's clipboard. We'll handle this button in the next lecture. The last piece of the application is being able to copy the changes we made to the box. If we look at the box computed property, the value we're returning in the function is what we want to return to the user. We're not going to add an object to the clipboard. We'll pass in the string version of this property. The browser has a simple function we can run for copying the data to the clipboard. Let's look at how we would do that. Let's switch over to the index file. Search for the second button in the template. We'll use this button to listen for a click. On it, add the click event listener with the prevent modifier. The name of the function we'll run will be called copy. Next, let's define the method in the instance. In the app.js file, we'll define the copy method to the methods object. Inside this function, define a variable called text. This variable will contain the text to copy to the clipboard. At the moment, the CSS's value is stored in a string. However, the property itself is not present in the value. For the sake of convenience, let's add the property name. Set this variable to a template string with the following content: transform, this.box.transform, semicolon. After creating this variable, we can start copying this value to the user's clipboard. After the variable definition, run a function called navigator.clipboard.writeText. The navigator object is defined by the browser. It'll contain various pieces of information about the user's browser. In addition to storing information, we can access an API called Clipboard. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this API's documentation page. This API is relatively new. It allows us to read, copy, and paste content into the clipboard. It's supported on all browsers and devices. Be warned, it does not work on older browsers. If your app depends on legacy browser versions, you might want to consider a different solution. Let's head back to the editor. The writeText function will copy text to the user's clipboard. This function is asynchronous. There are different ways to handle asynchronous code. In my opinion, I really enjoy using the async await syntax. It's easy to read and write. If you prefer to chain the then function, that's perfectly fine. For now, let's add the async keyword to the copy function. Now, add the await keyword to the writeText function. Lastly, pass in the text variable into the function. One more thing. It's a bad idea not to give feedback to the user. they should be informed of the successful action. Below the write text function, run the alert function with the following message: CSS copied to clipboard. We're finished. Let's try testing the button one more time. On the browser, refresh the page. Afterward, try changing the values and copying them to your clipboard by pressing the button. We can test if we have a copy by pasting the contents of the clipboard to the console. As you can see, we're able to copy the data to the user's clipboard successfully. We've successfully created our first app in Vue. We were able to utilize a lot of what we learned in the previous section. We have a tool we can use to test how an element will behave if we change its transform properties. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one.